In today's video, we're going to cover how to make old school boom bap. I'm going to show you multiple sampling techniques, tips on drum selection and drum patterns, useful effects, and a lot more. So let's get into it. To make this style of boom bap, we're going to be using multiple samples and layering them all together. And this might be something you struggle with, how to use more than one sample and how to piece them all together. So let's go over how you can do this. Starting from the top, we need to talk about choosing your samples first. If our approach is going to be to use multiple samples, we need to be smart with what we choose. A big mistake that many producers make is that they would choose samples that have a lot going on in them. But choosing a sample like this can make using multiple samples much easier, and you'll see why soon. You can think of this like making any other beat that doesn't use samples. Would it be a good idea to use a sound like this when starting your beat? Now this would leave you with a lot of room to add more to your beat afterwards, or would it be smarter to use a sound like this? It's pretty obvious which of these you should choose. So let's go ahead and chop the sample up, not the Baby Shark one, the other one. But before we do, hit like and subscribe. It really does help my channel out, and I'd definitely be thankful. And if you ever get tired of my videos, you can just unsubscribe. So using this section of the sample is going to be a good place to start. It's nice and open, and there's a lot of material to work with, lots of different chords in here. But before we start chopping the sample up, let's start by processing the sample first. Again, since the plan is to use multiple samples, reducing how much space the sample takes up can help us create more space that we can use for our next sample layer. So let's use an EQ. Here we're just isolating that Fender Rhodes that's playing in that low mid. Now the sample takes up drastically less space. It does feel a bit dead though with how many frequencies we removed. So to help with this, let's use Decimort. This will help reintroduce a little bit more color back into the sample. Using effects like this also really help emulate that old SP1200 feel, which is perfect for the style that we're going for. And if you're looking for a free alternative to this, Crush is one of the better free bit crushers. I haven't used it in a while, but I remember it being pretty decent. But with this tool, you can hear this adds some slight fuzz into the high end as well. We're using the tape hiss preset here. And this is useful because even a small high end hiss or static or vinyl noise can really help make your beat feel a lot more complete. Next, to make this sample sound even more low quality and degraded, let's add Decapitator onto it, which is a great saturation tool. And as you can see, I also put this layer into a mono space. With many of these older boom bap beats, they didn't really have the cleanest sound quality to them, which is what I like about them actually. But by really squishing many of your sounds and putting them into a closer space, it can help you achieve this rougher sound quality since your instruments and layers won't have as good of a separation. Sounds will start to overlap with one another and they become more dirty. This goes counter to a lot of mixing tutorials that focus on how to get your sounds to be as clean as possible. But with these types of beats, going the opposite way can be a good idea. Alright, this feels like it fits the aesthetic that we're going for. Let's go ahead and repitch this sample. Since this is our very first layer, this is completely up to us what we want to repitch this to. We can choose whatever sounds good. But later on in this beat, when we add our next sample layers in, we aren't going to be able to be as free. We'll need to make sure that our next layers fit with the pitch of this sample. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. First, we need to put together a loop. We have a lot of different chords playing in this area of our sample, so by piecing together different chords, we can build our own progression. So let's start by finding a good first chop. So this chop here sounds like a nice starting point for our loop. So far this sounds great. Now let's see which of these other chords here will fit with our first chop and just continue to build something that makes sense as a whole. All right, so we have a simple 2-bar loop. This is a great start. Let's go ahead and find another sample for our next layer. Once again, this is a pretty minimal sample. All we really have is a vibraphone and a piano, making this much easier to use since we don't have to worry about so many different instruments going all over the place. We can just focus on using this vibraphone sound in our sample as our next layer. So let's bring this into our sampler. And this is where matching the pitch of your sample can get difficult. You need to make sure you get this right. One way you can simplify this process is just to follow these steps. First, find a part of your sample that just has a single note playing. And we're going to use this as our test. Now, as our main loop is playing, we're going to start to repitch our entire sample while just playing that single note to listen to which of these pitches fits with our sample. This sounds all right. Our one single note here feels like it fits. And once we find one that does fit, let's play some additional notes to see if those fit as well. The remaining notes in this phrase don't really sound as great, so let's continue to keep on repitching the sample to see if something else fits better. This also sounds all right. Now let's play the full phrase. This sounds like it'll fit better, but we might need to do some reshaping to the sample a little bit. I just want the vibraphone from this sample, and you can hear we have that piano that comes in. I'm being very aggressive with my EQ here and really being restrictive. The reason being is my intent here is to use this as a more secondary layer. I don't want it to be very prominent. So with that idea in mind, I also want to add some reverb to push it back into the beat a bit more also. Alright, this sounds great. To help add some variation though, let's find some other different chops that we can use to help this feel a little bit more like a 4-bar loop instead of a 2-bar loop. And just like that, we have two samples that are working perfectly with one another. Let's go ahead and get crazy and see if we can add in a third sample. Now this sample has a lot more going on in it. This probably won't work as well, but I do like those little bells playing in the high end of the sample. So even though the sample is way more dense, it might be relatively easy to separate those bells out with an EQ. It might not work, but let's try it out. So here, once again, I'm being very restrictive with my EQ. You know, I had no intention of using the percussion from this sample. I just wanted to use that bell, but this actually sounds pretty great as a percussive loop. This is one of those happy little accidents that Bob Ross always talks about. This sounds cool to me, so let's use this as a percussion loop in the beat. This adds a sloppy off-kilter rhythm into the beat, which I like. Now this is a good amount of layers for now. We might come back in later and add some more layers, but for now I think it'd be a good idea to start with our drums. This is where you can easily go wrong and mess up your entire beat. Now one common mistake that I see producers make is choosing the wrong types of drums. For these older boom bap beats, relatively speaking, it's going to be a better choice to use more prolonged drum sounds. Often I'll see producers choose more transient sounds like this, and then they wonder why their beats feel so incomplete. With these older boom bap beats, the drums are a very large part of the beat, so we need to make sure we choose drums that fill up a lot more space. A great place to start looking for drums that fits with this style is by using drum breaks. But we don't have to use the entire break if we don't want to. We can just take individual pieces from multiple different breaks. Then we can piece them all together to create a drum pattern. So let's start by looking for a hi-hat. I'm going to go into my library of drum breaks and listen through a few of these. This drum break has a pretty thick sounding hi-hat, so let's isolate just a single hi-hat using Fruity Slicer. The reason why we're only going to use one single hi-hat rather than multiple hi-hats to make a more detailed drum pattern is because these old beats were very simply made. This is something that I covered in an older boom bap video of mine. The hardware that was used to make these beats were very limiting. Producers only had a small number of sounds that they were able to use. So limiting how many sounds you use in your beats can be a great way to help achieve this aesthetic. So we have a very simple pattern here. Let's go ahead and add a bit of processing on this hi-hat. First, I'm going to EQ it to rid some of those lower frequencies that I don't need here. And I'm also going to add reels. This not only degrades the sound and removes a lot of the high end so it sounds a little bit more rough, but it also has the noise feature here. This once again helps add a layer of noise into our beat that can help it sound a bit more full. And I'm also going to use a Transient Shaper and increase the release. This is a tool that can help you reshape your sounds. By using the release, we can extend the hi-hat so it becomes far more prolonged and sustained, and it ends up taking up a lot more space in the beat. You can hear the difference. This hi-hat sounds really good to me, especially with that percussion loop from our third sample layer. It feels like our high end is filling up really nicely. So next, let's add in our snare. Same process here. I'm just going to go through a bunch of different drum breaks and listen to which of these sounds like it would fit our beat. This snare sounds pretty good, but let's go ahead and EQ it to add a bit more body. For those of you that watched my prior video on the most typical mistakes that end up making your drum sound weak, you remember how important this frequency is. So our hi-hat and our snares are done. Let's move on to our kicks. Now I know that many of the kicks in my drum break library don't have much punch to them, so we're going to need to use multiple kicks here. So let's break this up into two different parts. First, let's find the kick that will provide the actual punch, the utility, the content for our kick. Then we'll find the second kick that will provide the color, the character for our kick. For the first punchy kick, let's go ahead and use this kick here. This kick does a good job of cutting through in the beat, and before finding our second kick layer, let's just go ahead and build out a kick pattern first. Up until now, you probably noticed that all of our other drum sounds have been pretty much on grid, and we quantized a lot of our sounds. And personally, I find having some instruments and sounds be very quantized while having other sounds be unquantized can provide a better feel for the beat. Some people like to completely unquantize every component in their beat, but for these types of beats, I find I get better results only unquantizing a few layers while having other layers be more on grid. So far, the hi-hat and the snare patterns have been very on grid, so I turned off quantization for the kicks. As I mentioned, the kick did a good job of cutting through, but it also feels a bit detached. The reason being, it doesn't have much character or color. If you ever get this feeling with your kick, like it feels detached from the rest of your sounds, it might be because it lacks those overlapping frequencies outside of that low end. So let's move on to step 2 and add color onto this kick. Once again, let's just listen through these drum breaks and just find a texture or color that feels like it would fit. This one here might be a good fit. Let's add it in and isolate just the kick. Now I'm going to copy and paste my kick pattern over. This kick feels a bit too colorful, a bit too bright, so to help with this, I'm going to go ahead and pitch this down quite a bit. I'm also going to add an EQ here, primarily to get rid of some of that brightness, but also to get rid of the low end since I don't need it. Alright, this drum pattern is sounding complete. This is sounding great to me. One thing to point out though, I did use parallel compression in order to make these drums sound better. If I didn't use parallel compression, you can hear what a difference this makes. This is a really helpful technique if you need to make your drums sound a lot more present in your beat. I've covered how to do this in an older video of mine. So if you need help understanding how to do this technique, check out the video that's showing up on the screen right now. I'll also put a link to that in the description. So next step, let's build out our bass line. As for what kind of bass to use, we could definitely sample a bass tone and use that to build a bass line. But I've already used a bunch of my credits to download these samples off TrackLib, and I'm a cheap bastard. So let's just go ahead and use a plugin to build our bass line. For these old school boom bap beats, using electronic basses or upright basses fit really well. So let's try to use the upright bass, which is commonly used in jazz, and see how that sounds. It sounds like it fits. It ties in with this jazz sample that we're using. Let's go ahead and adjust the drive though, which is basically a built-in saturator. This will be helpful since we don't have much going on in the low mid, so using a more colorful bass can help with this problem. Next, let's go ahead and build an actual bass pattern. Here, we're going to use our bass line to reinforce the progression from our sample. So let's listen to figure out what our progression is actually doing. It sounds like our sample's progression is going downwards overall, so we'll follow the same direction with our bass line. By no means am I saying this is the approach that you have to take when you build out your bass lines. To me, it just feels like our sample's progression is just a bit vague, so using our bass line can help really reinforce what it's supposed to be doing. This sounds great to me. We're almost done here. Let's go ahead and add in some of the smaller details that can make a big difference. Many of these old school boom bap beats use these periodic reverby, echoey one-shots throughout the loop, so we'll do the same. How we're gonna do this is just by looking for sounds throughout our samples and really constrict them and throw them back into space. Let me show you what I mean. Let's first listen through this sample here. So here we have that horn playing in the sample, so all I'm gonna do is really isolate a small frequency using an EQ. Then I'm gonna throw some reverb and delay on top. And this is gonna become a sound that I use periodically throughout my beat, and I'm just gonna do the same thing using other textures as well. Alright, we have a pretty good core loop here. Let's go ahead and move on to arranging this beat out. Here I'm just going to keep the structure of this beat very simple, again to keep with this aesthetic of an older beat, just some very simple additions and subtractions for our different layers. For the hook, I found yet another horn sample. And I split this into two different layers to create this part for the hook. I also took this acapella and added some shaper box onto it to add that scratching effect that you heard. So yeah, I'll go ahead and play the full beat for you, but if you want some more really helpful tips on how to make old school boom bap beats, I really recommend checking this video that's showing up right now. It's one of my most popular and helpful videos. I'll leave a link to this in the description box below, along with all the other videos that I mentioned in today's video. But if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, head over to betterbeatmaker.com, check out my full online beatmaking course. The link to my free drum kit's available in the description box below, as well as a link to the Discord to join my producer community. And without further ado, here's the full beat.